I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across the battlefront. Francis Dearnley continues his analysis of the shifting sands of French political opinion towards Ukraine, and we speak to our Defence Editor Danielle Sheridan about her eventful trip to a NATO exercise in Poland.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 14th of March. 2 years and 19 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, and Defence Editor Danielle Sheridan. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. So last night, latest wave of Russian air attacks. Ukraine shot down 22 of 36 Shahed drones fired into the country. 2 drones were destroyed over Mykolaiv, 3 over Dnipro. That comes from local authorities there. Groups of Russian drones were also spotted in Kharkiv and Sumy, according to the Air Force. No casualties reported. Kharkiv, you'll remember, only about 30 k's from the Russian border, came under both drone and missile attack. An S-300 missile was said to have struck a building in the city. That was the local police reporting there. Now then, elsewhere, if we look down in the Donbass, friends at the Institute for the Study of War say that the rate of Russian advance west of Avdiivka has recently slowed, although Russian forces likely retain the capability to intensify offensive operations in the area at a moment of their choosing. That's the ISW's assessment. They say Russian forces in the area are apparently reconstituting. Reconstituting is a military activity. You remember it's rest, repair, replenish, reorganise if necessary. So resting personnel as well as much as vehicles, reorganising the order of battle, taking whole units out and readjusting the business of the war as well. So reconstituting can be a big deal or a big event. Now that if they reconstitute, that those forces could serve as operational reserves. I always say you always need a reserve, something up your sleeve at every level of command in a military structure. Now Russia has not been very good at generating reserves in any real sense of the words, i.e. a force that is well rested, well trained, ready to go. Now then, if Russia, as we've seen, are just content to seemingly just push people forward into these meat assaults, as they're known, you don't really need reserves for that. You just need large bodies of men about to be turned into large bodies of men. But if they are actually constituting a reserve, that would be significant. Having a reserve could allow Russian forces to prevent the culmination of their offensive west of Avdiivka. Culmination is, again, another military term that basically means you're exhausted. You're not going back, you're not being forced back, but you've no longer got the puff to keep going forwards. But a reserve force, that could be a logical task. If reserves are used there to plug gaps or to exploit opportunities or to keep the momentum going if you think the enemy are falling back. So, have a reserve. It might help Russia get over a potential culmination of their offensive activities west of Avdiivka. Now, ISW say that Russia has the theatre-wide initiative, as in has across the whole of Ukraine in terms of the ground. The initiative is with Russia. Ukraine is largely on the back foot at the moment, so Russia could act or may not act. It's within the gift of the Russian commanders. Now, if a NATO force had the theatre-wide initiative that Russia is currently said to have in Ukraine, it would allow the command to dynamically reprioritise offensive operations across the front line, as in shift your resources about, push at the top, push at the south, push at the etc., etc. I'm not so sure the Russian chain of command has this flexibility or initiative. However, that's just my thoughts. The ISW also warn that the current Ukrainian front line could be more fragile than the relatively slow Russian advances in various sectors would indicate. What they mean by that is they say Ukrainian prioritization of the sectors most threatened by intensive Russian offensive operations could create vulnerabilities elsewhere up and down the line that Russian forces may be able to exploit. Again, we have the issue of quite how dynamic the Russian chain of command is, but all things to be considered. Now, these warnings were echoed, or continued, if you like, with Ukraine's chief of the armed forces saying he fears Russian forces could be poised to strike deep into Ukrainian lines in the east. This is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, General Alexander Syrsky. He said the situation on the battlefield was difficult. He was out visiting a couple of brigades and said the situation is gradually becoming more complicated and there is a threat of enemy units advancing deep into our battle formations. And just finally on this bit, today's British Ministry of Defence update says Russia is currently focusing its operations west of Avdiivka and Marinka. So Avdiivka just to the north, Marinka just to the west of Donetsk city. MOD here in London say those two axes account for 60% of Russian attacks in the last 4 weeks. And they note the average number of reported Russian ground attacks has only decreased by 13% from February this year, when the weekly average was 600. They say there's been a marked slowdown since Avdiivka was taken by Russia. So all speaks still very dynamic on the front in the east, although Russian advance to the west appears to be culminating. Like as I said, that means they will go firm, go static, replenish, etc., etc. But they do have the strategic initiative. If they've been able to generate reserves, they may be able to continue the push west. And General Syrsky sounding the alarm bells there, saying that it could be very problematic. Okay, next one. The Kyiv Independent is reporting this morning that Russian reconnaissance troops attempting to cross the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast were forced to abandon their mission after suffering heavy casualties. They're reporting that, quoting Ukraine's Ministry of Defence. So according to the Southern Operational Command, a boat carrying Russian troops attempted to land on the western bank, the right bank, near the Antonivsky Bridge, down near Kherson. The Southern Operational Command, in a post on Telegram, said a bunch of invaders were sent from the left bank of the Dnipro in Kherson Oblast in a motorboat to test their fate. Under heavy fire from the defence forces, the occupying boat magically repeated the fate of the Russian fleet. Having lost a quarter of its capacity and fullness, it retreated to the left bank again. Fighting down there is still said to be continuing. Ukraine pushed over the Dnipro months ago. I think, what was it, last September, October? Haven't progressed very far, but are still in the area of Krynki. So they've got a lodgement of about 5 k's deep-ish along that bank of the Dnipro. I've said before, I'm very surprised Russia has not been able to shove them out. Maybe Russia is thinking, well, they are not able to advance particularly well. It's very boggy, very marshy down there, a lot of rivulets. It's very difficult to move armoured vehicles across it. So maybe Russia's thinking it's a problem they don't have to attend to right now. Quite what this thing was that the Kyiv Independent is reporting, this effort to get across the river from Russia. I don't know if that's anything to do with maybe trying to regain lost ground in Kherson. Not sure, but anyway, we will obviously keep an eye on that. Now then, outside of Ukraine, Sochi Airport, the city, Russian city on the coast, footage posted on social media shows a big blaze and huge black smoke rising above the airport in Sochi. This is on the Black Sea coast. Videos from the airport appear to show a plane on fire and other buildings. Now, Russian authorities said it was planned. It was a planned military exercise, but the cause of the blaze remains unclear. And I have to say, I'm all for the phrase "train hard, fight easy," but if that thing was a military exercise, by God, they're taking it seriously, because it's a big old blaze. Go and have a look at that. Whether that was a Ukrainian strike, we don't know, but we will keep an eye on that as well. And then finally, for me, still got loads more. Sorry, take a breath, everybody. Right, the pro-Kyiv militia we've spoken about for the last couple of days, the Freedom of Russia Legion. They today renewed their call for civilians to get out of Belgorod and Kursk oblasts. They're the Russian regions bordering Ukraine. They threatened large-scale attacks on military targets in border cities this morning. Now, military operations have been ongoing since these anti-Russian forces started activity in the area on Tuesday. They still don't seem to have been dealt with, despite claims, was it yesterday from Moscow, that 250 people had been killed, but they're still going. So in a video posted on social media today, a member of the unit reportedly said, Immediately leave Kursk and Belgorod regions, all major population centres. We will open fire on military targets in this territory within an hour and a half after this appeal. So Alexander Baranovsky, a volunteer soldier for the group, said the aim of the strikes are to disrupt tomorrow's Russian cosplay election. Well, he didn't say the cosplay bit. Sorry, I did. I added that for accuracy. Mr. Baranovsky said that fighting has broken out in 5 settlements inside Russian territory, with footage circulating on social media of alleged strikes in Belgorod showing buildings, cars on fire. Thought that might have been caused by shelling, but there's something still happening. Russian state-owned news agency TASS, responding, said Moscow's forces were repelling attacks from these pro-Kyiv militia troops. Russia's National Guard, the Rosgvardia, together with the armed forces, are said to be fighting the Ukrainian-backed armed groups near the village of Tetkino. We've been speaking about that for a few days. In Russia's western Kursk region, that was from TASS. And then Russian MOD said it had thwarted an attempted breakthrough near the village of, Spodryoshino in Belgorod Oblast, a little bit further up, a little bit further sort of northwest from Tetkino. That breakthrough apparently attempted earlier today. That was according to Russian state-controlled media outlet RBC. Now, the Freedom of Russia Legion, the Siberian Battalion, and the Russian Volunteer Corps appealed to Kursk and Belgorod Oblast governors, urging them to declare an evacuation for citizens in the 2 regions and, quote, to stop following criminal orders. They said the liberation of Russian regions from Putin's terrorist regime is underway these minutes. Massive strikes are now being launched against Putin's forces in the Belgorod and Kursk oblasts. The operation to liberate the Kursk and Belgorod regions will continue until all aims are achieved. Now, yesterday, you may remember, the Russian MOD said its troops had thwarted the attempt by these forces to make a breakthrough. They said Ukraine had lost 250 military personnel, 7 tanks, several other vehicles and rocket launchers. I would just say, there's very little coming out of there, but there is a surprising lack of evidence, footage, or gloating on social media. So I would have expected that. It's one thing perhaps not to expect so much footage. Ukraine puts out a lot of footage of the fighting in Ukraine. I'm not that surprised that Russia doesn't put out so much footage of the fighting they're doing in Ukraine. I'm slightly surprised that they've not put out this footage in their own country. So not the chaos of the front line, if you can imagine that, in the Donbass. And so these massive thwarted thrust from these pro-Kyiv militia, I would have expected to see all over Russian social media. Can't find it. A couple more from me. A Ukrainian man suspected of working for Moscow has been arrested for planning to blow up a railway in Kharkiv. This comes from Kyiv's intelligence services today. The alleged saboteur is accused of trying to destroy power lines using homemade explosives in an attempt to disrupt supplies heading for Ukrainian troops. Now, the security service, SBU, said in a post on Telegram that the man's plans were discovered before he had a chance to carry out the attack, and the identities of his Russian contacts had been established. Then military intelligence, the GRU, the main director of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, GUR, said as a result of the special operation, an enemy saboteur who tried to detonate power lines of railway tracks and rolling stock near the junction station was detained. The attacker turned out to be a local resident. And then finally from me, the first deliveries of artillery ammunition under a Czech-led plan to boost supplies by buying shells outside of Europe should reach Ukraine by June at the latest. This comes from a senior Czech official speaking today. National Security Advisor Tomáš Požár, speaking to Reuters, said at the moment we are supplying large caliber ammunition secured under previous orders. First deliveries from the so-called Czech Ammunition Initiative can be expected in Ukraine in June at the latest. Now, that's good, interesting. We received a very interesting comment from Chris. Thanks, Chris, living in Perth, a city I hold very fond memories for, having worked in the Subiaco fish yard. But Chris asks about the EU's failed effort to deliver 1 million shells. Now, our colleague Joe Barnes has talked about this a lot. The EU said, pledged last year it was going to deliver 1 million shells. I think they've achieved, or they said they've done 300,000. They reckon 1 million by the end of this year. Chris says, well, and he's absolutely right. I dropped the ball on this one. I mean, we should have dug into it more. So, well, what happened? Did they say they were going to deliver 1 million shells and then just not put the purchase orders in? Did they put the purchase orders in and the manufacturers decided to go and do something else? Did they get no response to the tenders? What happened? That's a very interesting question. Thanks, Chris, for raising it, holding our feet to the fire. I will look at it. We'll ask the bearded wonder to have an ask around Brussels as well. But yes, absolutely. I mean, you can't just say you're going to deliver 1 million shells and then just hope they turn up. What happened next? And then what didn't happen next? Anyway, David, I will pause on that note.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for talking us through all of those updates. Francis, can I come to you? What's been on your radar this morning?
Thanks, David. I just added fish yard to our long list of Dom's stories for another day. We should do a special episode at some point. I spoke yesterday about the spectre of nuclear weapons and there being Putin's trump card. Well, apart from Donald Trump himself. And there's been quite an interesting development this morning. The Kremlin has come out publicly and said that Putin's comments that Russia has such weapons at the ready was unequivocally not a threat to use them if US troops were placed in Ukraine. So this comes from our old friend, Kremlin spokesman Peskov, who said that Putin had merely been answering a journalist's questions and that his comments were not a threat to use the weapons. He added that Putin has never considered using such weapons on Ukraine. I'm not sure that's quite true. And that Western media has purposefully misconstrued the Russian leader's comments. This was deliberately taking something out of context, he said. Putin made no such threats about the use of such weapons in this interview. The president was just talking about the reasons that could make the use of atomic weapons inevitable. So why this rather curious backtracking? We don't know exactly, but one possible reason that there has been alarm behind closed doors from some of Russia's allies, such as China, who were allegedly vital in getting Putin to stop his saber-rattling following the full-scale invasion. It's also worth mentioning that such threats do have economic consequences if investors think that a large-scale war might break out, or if a country's at risk of losing investment from other countries. Either that, it could just simply be an attempt to put the blame of atomic nuclear escalation on the West. But nonetheless, something's going on, and I think it is quite interesting and worthy of note. Another development I mentioned yesterday, just to stress for listeners further afield, the genuine anxiety felt in some European countries about the direction of travel, was that Warsaw's mayor was investing in bomb shelters were the worst to happen. Well, in a similar vein, Denmark is now planning to conscript women and increase the length of national service from 4 months to 11 months for both genders. That's coming from the country's Prime Minister today. We do not rearm because we want war, she said. We are rearming because we want to avoid it. Channeling, consciously or not, that famous Latin maxim, if you want peace, prepare for war. For context, Denmark currently has up to 9,000 professional troops on top of the 4,700 conscripts undergoing basic training, according to official figures. The government wants to increase the number of conscripts by 300 to reach a total of 5,000. All physically fit men in Denmark over the age of 18 are called up for military service, which lasts 4 months. However, because there are enough volunteers, there is a lottery system, meaning that not all young men serve. But now we're seeing, of course, a change with women being brought in, as well as an increase in the numbers that they are asking for. The Defence Minister has said that the security policy situation in Europe has become more and more serious, and we have to take that into account when we look at future defence. Now, continuing my new alter ego of Francophile Francis from yesterday's episode, something, by the way, that seems to have highly amused many listeners, so thanks to all of you who have reached out, especially in France. It is worth mentioning that Marine Le Pen has made some strong pro-Ukraine remarks today in response to Macron's positioning himself in such a way that obliges his rival to make her position clear. She said, and I quote, "By invading Ukraine, Russia triggered a war on the EU's doorstep and a geopolitical crisis undoubtedly the most dramatic in the last 20 years. To the attacked Ukrainian nation, we owe our respect and support." So, not weak words, but nevertheless, she said that, and abstained from voting for the France-Ukraine bilateral security agreement, which was the topic of the debate where she said those words. So I don't think it's too far to suggest that it is advisable to maintain a sceptical line of deeds, not words, in the French context. But I would love to be wrong and see that actually there is a universality in its stronger support for Ukraine that we discussed at length yesterday. Now, closer to home, we'll be hearing from our very own Danielle Sheridan shortly, who's just got back from Poland with the British Defence Secretary Grant Shapps. She'll discuss the notable announcements that he made there, which can be seen in the broader context of Europe waking up to the danger posed by the possible American withdrawal under a Trump presidency. Now, I know some listeners are sceptical that it would be possible or even likely that Trump would follow through and completely withdraw support from Ukraine and potentially even pull the US out of NATO. I hear you, and that's been a conversation, of course, we've had with many Americans recently. But I think the likelihood of that is actually irrelevant for two reasons. One, the obvious point, if the danger is there at all, then Europe has no choice but to respond, given the risks. There was a strong case that it should have been less reliant on the US for many years. The risks of it being unstable, unreliable on defence matters were obvious to many, and yet it was reluctant to respond. Of course, those famous moments, I think, that will go down in history where notable senior figures, I think it was mostly the German delegation, but it wasn't just them, to be fairness, were laughing at Donald Trump when he was saying that they should be paying the 2% GDP. Doesn't seem quite so unwise now. And of course, that embarrassment for Trump is something that no doubt he remembers and has made reference to in recent months. But second, and I think more importantly in a way, because this tends to be lost when we're talking about this, so many European countries are taking a stronger line than Washington of what they want the result to be in Ukraine, i.e. with a total Russian defeat where Ukraine keeps and wins back its sovereign territory. That being the case, then they have no choice, Europe, to arm, because even under President Biden, there is that reluctance we've spoken about many times to give the weapons Ukraine needs in order to achieve that aim. So whichever way one looks at it, Europe has no choice but to become more self-reliant, even in, crucially, the very best case scenarios. Relatively speaking, the Democrats have, of course, been a vital ally of Ukraine. I'm not trying to disagree with that statement, but they are still reluctant with regards to key elements of what is, many would argue, essential for Ukraine to receive in order for them to make the strides in Crimea and other elements of the battlefront that would see a total Ukrainian victory. And we need to remember that. So either way, I think Europe now has a responsibility to become self-reliant, but it remains a core question of the timescale in which that is conceivably possible.
Thank you so much, Dom and Francis. We'll come back to you shortly for your final thoughts. But first, let's catch up with our defence editor, Danielle Sheridan, who's just returned from a trip to Poland. So, Danielle, you've been on quite an interesting trip with the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. Can you tell us where you went and what you saw?
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. Yes, so along with some other journalists, I accompanied Grant Shapps to Poland. On Tuesday, he was visiting troops who are taking part in Exercise Steadfast Defender. It's the biggest joint NATO military operation since the Cold War, and in a nutshell, it is sending a message to Putin that NATO members are ready, they're agile, they're mobile, they can move at pace, and they can work in a whole host of environments and are ready if Russia decides to invade any of the NATO countries.
One of the questions I quite enjoy asking is, to lots of different people, is what did you expect before you went out there? And maybe how was that different to what you found, if at all?
Well, as defence editor, I have been on a few of these kind of trips. The notable thing about this is it's the biggest exercise, as I said, since the Cold War. So it doesn't really compare, I suppose, to other exercises I've been on. I mean, I've been covering defence since 2020 now, and over the years I've been to Cyprus or North Macedonia, Germany, Senelaga in Germany, and I've seen troops exercising, and at the back of whatever they've been doing, it's always been in an effort to send a message to potential adversaries. It's only since the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that people started actively declaring Russia being the main adversary that they were working to prepare against. So I'm always surprised, I suppose, how the soldiers, when we get to speak to them on the ground, don't really get too political. I always go in there and say, are you genuinely concerned about a threat from Russia? Do you believe that the UK could go to war? When you're doing these exercises, are you thinking this could be very much eventuality and something that I will be doing in my future? And none of them ever say that so bluntly. I mean, perhaps they're spoken to and told, a journalist coming over, don't be loose-lipped. But there is always a kind of quiet confidence that they are really well versed in what they're doing. They know how to do good soldiering, and they're confident in their ability as well as NATO's. So I suppose I'm not surprised whenever I go there, because I'm used to seeing soldiers training with other nations and acting out potential scenarios, whether it be what we saw on the ground yesterday. There was a kill house where British soldiers from 7th Brigade Desert Rats were enacting a scenario where Poland were the enemy and the UK troops had to go into a kill house and take down the soldiers that were the hostile party. And that was interesting to see, because you see how effective they are with their guns, albeit dummies, and you see how they can zone in on a target and eviscerate it. So it's always interesting to see.
Did you get any sense of, something that some Ukrainian soldiers were telling me when I was out there a couple of weeks ago was maybe dissatisfaction is too strong, but they wanted to make the point that some of the NATO tactics strategy that they'd been taught wasn't appropriate for the war that they'd been fighting, that they're not hypermobile, they don't have the best kit in the world all the time, and so therefore they had to find a different way of fighting the war. Just wondering, do you think NATO commanders and soldiers and people that you've seen are sort of taking that on board, or did it feel like a sort of 100% like NATO exercise?
That's a really good point and very interesting. And I suppose you asked, was I surprised? The thing that's most surprised me since covering defence was when I went to Ukraine and found myself in trenches that were taller than myself, and seeing soldiers practicing with bayonets, throwing them into mud-built walls to perfect their shoot, I suppose. I didn't think that in this day and age I would ever be in a trench. I read poetry about world wars when I was growing up that was all about trench warfare, and I thought those days were behind me. So what's interesting now when I go out on these exercises is, yes, I haven't been taken into any trenches. Now, that's not to say that they aren't enacting that kind of soldiering, but if they are, they're not showing it to journalists. What I'm seeing is fancy kit. I'm seeing effective tanks. I'm hearing artillery going off. I am seeing soldiers with excellent guns in all the best kit, well-fed people. And I say well-fed because that was one of the things that old saying, an army marches on its stomach. The number of soldiers in Ukraine that spoke to me and said, oh, we're absolutely starving, and we haven't slept well, we don't have enough food. And I've never seen a shortage of food when I've been out there. So that's actually not a question I've put to them. Do you think that actually this NATO exercise should be focusing more on trench warfare and less about
drones
kit?
As well? Did you see many drones at all? Or?
I don't think I did see drones, but I'm almost positive there would have been drones. But I didn't personally see them with my own eyes. I did see lots of helicopters going overhead, and like I said, the tanks that were rolling around. But yeah, that's a really good point, and I think I should, next time I'm lucky enough to brush shoulders with soldiers on the ground, I should be asking them that.
What did you make of Grant Shapps on this trip? I mean, he's still not been in the role that long. Do you think he's sort of settled in? Does he look confident and sort of on top of his brief?
I think Grant Shapps is really enjoying being Defence Secretary. I think he has a genuine interest in the military. I didn't know this, but he's a trained pilot.
Didn't know that either. Wow.
Yes, so he has a particular interest in aviation, and he also revealed that if he were called upon to sign up to the military, he would like to do so as an RAF pilot.
Wow.
So there you go, scoop. Grant is also actively calling for 3% of GDP to be spent on defence. Obviously, the recent budget didn't go as far as he would have liked. The UK spends 2.27% of GDP on defence. He would like it raised. He's made no bones about this. Before, when he ran for Prime Minister, he said that he would like the spend to rise to 3%. And he is very passionate about this because we are living in a dangerous world. What more of an important thing to spend money on than the nation's defence? He really gets it. He sees it from his recent visit to Kyiv, where he sat down with Zelensky. He knows how aggressive Russia is. And when we were having a conversation, he made the point that we can't bat an eyelid over what we're spending on defence, because this isn't just about what is happening right now. The focus is on Ukraine. But in 10 years' time, it could be the Indo-Pacific. It could be China takes Taiwan. We really can't afford to not be investing in this area. And I think it's unsurprising that a Secretary of State asks for more money in their department, but I think that what he is asking for right now really shows how strongly he feels about the state of the nation's defences and why it's never been more important to put money into it.
There was an incident on the way out to Poland and on the way back on the plane that you were on. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, so I don't know if our news editors will be listening to this podcast, but I'm quite often late with my copy. And for the first time in my life, I think I had a genuine excuse, which was that the plane had been jammed by Russians.
So the communications on the plane?
The GPS signal had been jammed by Russians. So to break down what that means, it's like having a sat-nav. The pilots will follow that in order to get from A to B. That went down. So fortunately, the plane is equipped with backup systems, so they were able to turn to another method in order to put out their GPS coordinates and safely get to Poland. The issue was when we went through Kaliningrad. That's when all the comms went down and we lost Wi-Fi and, as I said, GPS signals. So it meant that for half an hour each way, as in out there and back, we didn't have GPS. The pilots didn't have GPS. It's fine. It wasn't a risk because, like I said, they have backups. The risk is for lighter aircrafts that are susceptible to such jamming attacks, because they won't have all of the necessary equipment in their aircraft to successfully manoeuvre such a situation.
What was Grant Shapps' reaction? Did you see him react to this news that suddenly the comms had gone down?
Well, it's quite funny because I was trying to send an email and I couldn't send it and I was getting frustrated. And then I was saying, is anyone else having a problem with their internet? And that kind of conversation happened. And I think it goes through your mind, we're probably being jammed or something. But it was only Grant had gone up front with the pilots and he came back to the plane. And then we had a conversation about what had happened. But he was totally relaxed and he'd been with the pilot. So for him, he knew that the situation was completely under control. But there is a wider, more serious message, which is that Russia likes to agitate and it likes to cause disruption and will do so by any means. And if it can mess with NATO nations without violence, then that's a successful target. Then that is a successful tactic, because it can't be called outright for aggression because it's very passive.
That's really fascinating. That's quite a moment.
It was interesting.
Danielle Sheridan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's go to our final thoughts then. Dom, would you like to go first?
I've been looking today at the NATO's annual report for last year. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General's launched it. I haven't read through the whole report yet, but interesting in he gave a press conference this morning and made a speech sort of launching the doc and said all the things you'd expect, but I think it's worth reiterating some of the more punchy statements. So Jens Stoltenberg said, "Together we have the capacity to provide Ukraine what it needs. Now we need to show the political will to do so. All allies need to dig deep and deliver quickly. Every day of delay has real consequences on the battlefield in Ukraine." So I think, those bits there, I mean, that just sort of highlights where we are at the moment. NATO and the West has the capacity. We need political will, deliver quickly, all the consequences of not so doing. So he's just kind of wrapping it all up there, as you may expect. But, this does help having people of this calibre and in these appointments making the case time and time again. This is how political, I mean, Francis was no better than me, having dallied in politics, but this is how it works. You build the pressure, and people are then invited to respond to it. So they can ignore it, but when you actually put it to them and say, well, what's your response? They've got nowhere to go. And just interesting the way he finished off that section. He said, "So this is a critical moment, and it would be a grave historic mistake to allow Putin to prevail. We cannot allow authoritarian leaders to get their way by using force. This would be dangerous for us all." Again, I say, you might think, well, yeah, that's what we've been saying for a long time, but it is important. It is noted when people of this, such as Mr. Stoltenberg, say these things. So I just hope this momentum builds. We've got NATO 75th round the corner in June, something like that, early June, 3 days. So, there's a building ahead of steam ahead of that historic meeting marking the 75th anniversary of NATO, at which the next Secretary General is expected to be announced. I've got a fiver on Mark Rutte. There we go. So these things are all these political comments on the back of what Macron's been saying this week. This is the building ahead of steam now for the politics. We just now need somebody to jump first. And maybe this Czech-led initiative about the artillery shells could be the bit that just starts the pebble rolling down the hill and gathering momentum. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Dom. Francis Dearnley, would you like the very final words for today?
Thanks, David. To end on a slightly different note today, listeners will recall our mentioning some months ago concerns about the possible purchase of the Telegraph by the United Arab Emirates and the possible consequences for our editorial freedom. A particular concern for us here reporting on Ukraine because of the UAE's very friendly relationship with Russia, something we've spoken about many times recently. Thank you again to all of those listeners who wrote to the paper to express their concerns, both in physical form and digitally. It was genuinely humbling and massively appreciated that so many of you took the time to do that. We still have listeners asking for updates on this, and I wanted to share, therefore, some welcome news from yesterday. The British government has formally decided to ban foreign state ownership of and influence over newspapers and periodicals in this country. While we still await the details of what is being proposed in order to build that legal framework, it has committed to a legal amendment unambiguously preventing foreign state ownership, control and influence, crucially, over newspapers. To quote from our leader, by which I mean the paper's editorial today, "This is about principle. In our view, it would be better to have a clear-cut prohibition rather than a complex regulatory framework, which we respect we are now going to get. Nevertheless, this has been an unsettling time for the staff of The Telegraph and its readers and listeners, worried that the independence of the newspapers would be compromised if they passed into the hands of a foreign state, even at arm's length. The relationship between newspapers and politicians is often a fractious one, so it is gratifying to report that a way forward is beginning to emerge as a result of a tenacious campaign in Parliament. The efforts of many in this country and abroad to ensure a free and fair press has been heroic." So whilst anxieties remain, especially about the future ownership of The Telegraph, it seems that the fundamental battle of principle has been won about foreign ownership. So again, thank you to all of you who made your views known to the editors here. It did make a difference.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.